Okay, thank you for participating today in the NALS webinar, Grammar Review. My name is Kathy Siekman, and I'll be leading this session. To ensure good sound quality with no background noise, we've muted your phone lines for the portion of today's presentation. This session is also being recorded. If you have a question during the presentation, please feel free to type them using the chat feature on the left of your screen, or select the raise hand button on the left of your screen, and then I'll call on you and get those questions answered. All right, so we will start and go through it. So we'll start with periods. Do you use them at the end of a statement or command, at the end of a polite request or command, at the end of an indirect question, and with decimals? The one that seems to give people the most problem is the polite request or command, and that's sometimes hard to figure out. And I would just ask yourself if you're asking the reader a direct question or if it's something you expect them to do, like when your boss asks you to do something. That's really a polite request and not a question. Use periods in outlines or displayed lists, unless the number is in parens, and then you don't need a period. But do use them after independent clauses, dependent clauses, long phrases, and short phrases excuse me, that are essential to grammatical completeness of the statement. So in this example, please get me year-end figures on domestic sales revenues. That makes sense. And please get me the year-end figures on total operating costs. That makes it a complete statement, so you would use periods after those. And it's the same when you use bullets. Instead of letters or numbers, you would still use the periods at the end. Don't use them after short phrases if the introductory statement is grammatically complete, or if the listed items are like an inventory sheet or a shopping list. So this example, the handheld computers in this price range offer the following features. That's a grammatically complete thought. So the rest is just kind of a list of what you get with those handheld computers. So you would not use periods there. You should use a colon after the element introducing the list. So after following features was a colon. And in a displayed list, the first word of each item should be capitalized. Use periods with headings, like run-in headings, where one begins the paragraph and it's immediately followed by the text matter on the same line. So you would use the period there, but not when it's a freestanding heading just all by itself and then the text is underneath it. You would not use a period there. Some don'ts with periods. Don't use it after letters that designate persons or things, but when it is the initial of the person's name, you would use it. You don't need to use periods after contractions, after ordinals that are in figures, or after Roman numerals, except where it's actually numbering something in an outline. Use question marks. We'll move on to question mark to indicate a direct question after a rhetorical question, which is actually a question that you really don't expect a reply to. And if the first clause of a compound sentence is rhetorical and the second clause is a statement, just use a period to end the sentence. And that's where both parts of the sentence are complete independent clauses. So why not rent a house here for the summer? It's really a rhetorical question. You're not really asking them to do it. And then you'll know whether this is a place where you'd like to retire. Use a question mark at the end of an elliptical question, which is a condensed question. So Marion tells me you're coming to the Bay Area when. The complete question would be, when are you coming? And then punctuate complete and elliptical questions separately according to your meaning. Where shall we meet? At the airport. That allows for meeting somewhere else. Or where shall we meet at the airport is asking for a specific location inside the airport. So that will depend on where you put the question marks in those cases. Indicate questions within sentences with a question mark. So you forgot to make the hotel reservations, didn't you? Didn't you is really the question, but that's where you would put the question mark. To indicate. However, with the series of questions at the end of the sentence, use commas or question marks. So if it's really long, like the second part of this, who will be responsible for drafting the proposal? Each piece of that you could put question marks, or you could use commas. Personally, I prefer commas, but it also, that sentence implies that one person is going to be asked to do all of it. The second sentence leaves it open for different people to do it. So when you use separated commas, that makes it clear that one person is not doing everything, that you're asking for different people to do the different tasks. Use a question mark to express doubt in parentheses. I see that a lot, actually. When you're not sure of something, that's an indicator that you need to confirm information, or that the reader knows that you're not positive that that information is correct. And an exclamation point is used to express strong feeling and can be used in place of a question mark if you really want to express strong feeling. And with O and O, you use an exclamation mark. Then here is just a grammar giggle with random exclamation marks. Winner of over 500 exclamation mark barbecue awards. Not sure why they put the exclamation mark right after the number, but they did, and I captured it. So the comma is really one of the most overused and wrongly used pieces of punctuation in my personal opinion. So we'll start off with commas. Set off non-essential expressions that interrupt the flow of thought. In a lot of sentences you can tell whether it's non-essential or essential by trying to omit the expression. If you can leave it out without affecting the meaning or structural completeness of the sentence, then it's non-essential and should be set off by commas. So if you say, let's get the advice of Harry Stein, who has in-depth experience with all types of personal computers, before we decide which computer to buy, you could say, let's get the advice of Harry Stein before we decide which computer to buy. The other information is just extraneous information that you don't need to make the sentence complete. So you can set that off with commas. And when you use the who clause with a specific person like that, it's helpful but non-essential information. You can take it out and it doesn't change the meaning of the sentence. Here's another grammar giggle. The comma is incorrect. There are no dependent clauses here. They're two independent sentences. But they had more problems than that comma. Okay, use commas with clauses in complex sentences. introductory dependent clauses, if they had invested more carefully, set that off. Usually if the word if is in the sentence, there should be a comma there somewhere. Dependent clauses elsewhere in the sentence, is that clause necessary to the meaning of the sentence or just providing additional descriptive or explanatory detail? So those two examples, D'Amato's suggestion and then D'Amato's latest suggestion that we submit the issue to arbitration. You really don't need to know that that was his latest suggestion. It's just extra information. So the non-essential piece can be set off by commas. Use commas in dates when you're using month, day, year. Use a comma to separate the day and year and then after the year, unless a stronger mark of punctuation is required. But so the first example, October 23rd, comma, 2018, comma, is the date. And that is, I don't see that used very often, and a lot of people don't like it, but it's, according to Greg, it's correct to put the comma after the year. Omit the comma when only the day, month and day are used. You don't need a comma there. Then with junior, senior, etc., do not use the comma to set it off unless you know they prefer to do so. So unless you know that their preference is to use a comma after Stanley Smith, comma, junior, I wouldn't use a comma after Smith. Commas with abbreviations, academic degrees, and religious orders. Use a comma to set those off because it is actually kind of extra information because you have their name, but you don't need to know that they're an Esquire. But it is a term of the academic degree, and so you should add it, but it can be set off by commas. Don't use commas to set off Inc. or Ltd. unless you know their particular organization prefers it, the same as the junior, senior. Do you use them in geographic references and addresses to set off the name of the state, country, or equivalent when it directly follows the name of a city or county, but not between the state and the zip code when you're using the full address? In a series, the serial or Oxford comma should be used. I think it's confusing not to. So use the comma before the last part of the series, before the and. And a lot of people have very strong views about the serial or Oxford comma. So, but it is confusing, I think, not to. And here was a case in the First Circuit Court of Appeals that hinged on a serial comma. And because they didn't have one, the workers won, I think it was $5 million. Yep, the dairy drivers. They'd asked for $10 million, but it looks like they settled for $5 million, and all because of a comma. Because the language said storing, comma, packing for shipment or distribution of. And so the question was if packing for shipment was its own activity or was it packing for the distribution of things on the list. And if a comma had separated that, it would have been clearer. But the drivers arguing for overtime actually distribute the food, but they don't pack it. So that argument helped to win that case. So that's kind of interesting. I love when there's punctuation in the news. It's always my favorite. Oh, see, there it is. Packing for shipment or distribution of. And so after the case, they put semicolons between everything to make it perfectly clear that they were separate activities. So I think they went a little crazy, but they got their point across. Here's another grammar giggle. Was the booze really arrested? The officer who was found with the girl and booze was arrested, or the officer arrested found with girl and booze. They could have done it so many other ways. Use a comma to indicate omitted words. If you have repetitive wording, like if I'm to speak for 10 minutes, I need a week, 15 minutes, 3 days. You put a comma there because you've taken some of the information out, but people should know what you mean. And I do have a lot of grammar giggles around commas because there's a lot of trouble people have with commas. Enjoy your Thanksgiving turkeys or enjoy your Thanksgiving turkeys. So it all depends on where the comma is. Semicolons. So between independent clauses where and, but, or nor are omitted, you should use a semicolon. Between independent clauses where those are included to achieve a stronger break, you can use a semicolon. And when one or both clauses have internal commas and could be confusing, you can use a semicolon. And those are good examples. And then many people are convinced they could personally solve the problem if given the authority to do so. Yep, that sentence. A comma is okay, but a semicolon gives it a stronger break. And then with transitional expressions, use the semicolons to separate the phrases. Use it with, for example, namely, that is, before an independent clause. Use a semicolon at the end of a sentence. And within a sentence, when it's non-essential, use commas, dashes, or parentheses. But treat it as non-essential. Let's see. Many of the components, for example, the motor, are manufactured by outside suppliers. Treat it as non-essential and set it off with commas. Semicolon in a series. Use it to separate items in a series if any of the items already contain commas. Again, we kind of went over that. You can also use parentheses to enclose the title following the name if you just wanted to use commas. And use semicolons with dependent clauses to separate parallel dependent clauses if they're long or contain internal commas. It's a lot. If you do have a lot of commas, it's much better to use semicolons in between so that it's clearer. Otherwise, you just get too many commas and get a little overwhelmed. Use a colon. We're on colons now between independent clauses where the second clause explains or illustrates the first, and before lists and enumerations. So if you're going to use, for example, this second example, the company provides a number of benefits not commonly offered in this area, colon, for example. That's a good use of the colon. An expression of time and proportions in business documents, in business letters, the reference notations, the attention line, subject line, and in memos and business documents after guide words. Use a colon in references to books or publications to separate the title and subtitle of a book and to separate the volume number or page number in footnotes or similar references. Don't capitalize the first word after a colon if the material that follows cannot stand alone as a sentence. Don't capitalize the first word of an independent clause after a colon if the clause explains, illustrates, or amplifies what was expressed in the first part of the sentence. And capitalize the first word of an independent clause after a colon only if it requires special emphasis or is presented as a formal rule. Capitalize after the colon when the material following consists of two or more sentences, when the material following is a quoted sentence, and when the material following the colon starts on a new line. Capitalize when the material preceding the colon is an introductory word or phrase, and when material preceding the colon is the name of the speaker in a transcription or court testimony or script for a play. Now the dash. You can use the dash in place of a comma, semicolon, colon, or parentheses. Use it for a more emphatic separation, or use it in place of commas to set off non-essential elements that require special emphasis. But if it already contains internal commas, use dashes in place of commas to set it off. But note there are no spaces between the word and the dash. So it should be speakers dash and the food dash were superb with no spaces between the word and the dash. Use a dash in place of a semicolon for a stronger but less formal break, or in place of a colon for, again, a stronger but less formal break, or in place of parentheses where you want to give strong emphasis. Use a dash to indicate an abrupt break or an afterthought, to show hesitation, to emphasize single words with repetitions, restatements, and summarizing words, and before attritions. Don't use a comma, semicolon, or colon before the opening dash. It should just be the dash. When the statement or command is set off by dashes, don't use a period before the closing dash, except in an abbreviation. And when a question or exclamation is set off by dashes, use the question mark or exclamation point before the closing dash. Following the closing dash, when the dash is at the end of the sentence, use the punctuation at the end of the sentence, not the closing dash. So in that case, you would just have the opening dash and then the closing punctuation for the sentence. Now parentheses, use it with explanatory material that's independent of the main thought of the sentence, and to set off a non-essential element when dashes would be too emphatic and commas might cause confusion. Use them to set off references and directions, and with dates. Use parentheses with enumerated items within a sentence and in a displayed list. You can use them. For parenthetical items within sentences, make sure punctuation comes after the item falls outside the closing parentheses. Don't capitalize the first letter of an item in parentheses, even if the item is a complete sentence. Don't use a period before the closing parentheses except with an abbreviation. Don't use a question mark or exclamation point before the closing parentheses unless it applies solely to that parenthetical item and the sentence ends with a different mark of punctuation. Now, quotation marks. Use those to indicate use of exact words, to set off words and phrases for special emphasis, and to display titles of literary and artistic works. So with direct quotations is Greg 227, and then for special emphasis, those are some examples. Use quotations with words that are used humorously or ironically, or words and phrases that are introduced by expressions like marked, labeled, signed, entitled, or titled. Then use that. Use quotation marks to set off the word that is being marked, labeled, signed, and all of those. With literary titles of literary and artistic works, use quotation marks around titles that represent only part of a complete published work, titles of chapters, lessons, topics, sections, etc., titles of articles and feature columns in newspapers and magazines, and title of essays and short poems. And then use quotation marks around titles of songs or other short musical compositions, and titles of individual segments or programs that are part of a larger television or radio series. There's some examples of that. Quotations within quotations. You use a pair of single quotation marks that match the style of the regular quotation marks you're using, whether they're straight or curly, but you go from double to single, and then back, use the end with your single quote, and then at the end of the whole quotation, use the double. If a quotation appears within single quoted, revert to double quotation marks for the inner portion. So you would go double for the entire quote, single for the subquote, double for the quote, subquote within the single quote, and then end the same way. A proofreading tip is to match up beginning and ending quotation marks. So if I see a quotation mark, I always look to see if it ends, and then go back and proof the language, because sometimes by the time you get to the end, you've forgotten that it was a quotation. Quotation marks with periods and commas. Periods and commas always go inside closing quotation marks. That's the American style. And they always go inside the single closing quotation mark as well. Semicolons and colons always go outside the closing quotation mark and always go outside the single closing quotation mark. Question marks and exclamation points at the end of a sentence. If the question mark or exclamation point goes inside the closing quotation mark when it applies only to that quoted material. If it's at the end of the sentence, the question mark or exclamation point is outside if it applies to the entire sentence. So those examples there can help. With dashes, a dash goes inside the closing quotation mark to indicate the speaker or writer's words have broken off abruptly. A dash goes outside the closing quotation mark where the sentence breaks off abruptly after the quotation. And a closing dash goes outside the closing quotation mark when the quotation itself is part of a non-essential element being set up by a pair of dashes. So because in that last example, let's go with this is not part of it's a quotation that's not being set off by the dashes, so the dash goes outside that quotation mark. With parentheses, the closing parenthesis goes outside the closing quotation mark, where the parenthetical element is part of the quotation. And the closing parentheses goes outside closing quotation mark where the quotation is part of the parenthetical element. So it just depends on whether the quotation is part of the parenthetical element or not as to whether the closing quote paren goes inside or outside. Ordinarily, you capitalize the first word of every complete sentence in quotation marks. If it's preceded by that or is otherwise incorporated into the flow, then you do not capitalize it. Omissions in quoted materials. If one or more words are omitted, use ellipses marks to indicate omissions. And note that ellipses are 3 periods with a space before and after each period. I think Microsoft Word has their own style, and it is 3 periods crammed together with no spaces in between. But according to Greg, that isn't correct. If you have insertions in quoted material, you can insert those in brackets. For special emphasis, you may italicize them, italicize words that were not so treated in the original, like emphasis added in brackets immediately after the italicized words, or in parentheses immediately after the quotation. So people know that that wasn't the way it was in the original, even though you're quoting it. So you've adjusted the style of the words. Yes, Greg is pretty smart, and they keep updating it, which some of the other style books do not update as often as Greg does. So I tend to trust Greg a little bit more. And it's easier to use than Strunk and White, in my humble opinion. Insertions in quoted material. When the original word, this is one of my favorites actually, when something contains a misspelling, a grammar error, or confusing expression of thought, put the term sick in brackets to indicate that the error existed in the original and it wasn't yours. And sick means so, or this is the way it was. But you can't go crazy with it, because that'll just make people nuts. So I use it when it really makes a difference and it's obvious that it was their mistake and not mine. So because I don't want attorneys changing it, like, why didn't she catch this? So sometimes I'll put sick and I'll let them decide which ones they want to keep. Italics and underlining. Use that for special emphasis, and we do use italics more, it seems like these days, than underlining, like case titles are italicized, and so I see that a lot more than underline. When you refer to letters as letters, usually italicize or underline them if they're not capitalized. And if in a formal definition, you can italicize or underline the word to be defined, just so it kind of sets it off a little bit. Foreign expressions that are not considered part of the English language should be italicized or underlined. And italicize or underline complete works that are published as separate items, like books, pamphlets, newsletters, long poems, titles of movies, plays, musicals, operas, ballets, all of that. With titles of literary and artistic works, do not italicize, underline, or capitalize the word magazine unless it actually is part of the title. Don't italicize punctuation following an italicized word unless that punctuation is part of that element. Don't italicize or underline a possessive or plural ending that's added onto a word that's being emphasized. So that times, I don't even know how to say that, apostrophe S, the apostrophe S is not italicized, but the rest of the word is. Other marks of punctuation, here's the ellipses marks, 3 spaced periods. The asterisk you can use to refer the reader to a footnote or a table, or use it to replace words that are considered unprintable, which isn't a lot these days, but there are some. The slash is certain abbreviations and expressions of time and used to express alternatives. Brackets, again, correction or insertion in a quoted extract should be in brackets. Angle brackets set off website or email addresses when they appear within sentences or in bibliographical notes and citations. So before the www is an angle bracket. Apostrophes you can use as a single quotation mark to indicate omission of figures and dates, as a symbol for feet, to form contractions, to form plurals of letters, abbreviations, figures, and words in a few special cases, like 3 A's, because if you didn't have the apostrophe, you wouldn't know for sure whether it was A's or as. Use this apostrophe to form possessives and to form expressions derived from all cap abbreviations, but not to make words plural. Apostrophe does not make it plural, so Bill apostrophe S is incorrect, and the comma should be inside the quotation mark. That's one of my biggest issues that I have, is people using apostrophes to make a word plural. It just doesn't work except in very, very limited cases. And here's another one. Apparently there was only one teacher on strike because they used a singular possessive. So you need to start with the word you need and then make it possessive. Don't just add apostrophe S to everything thinking that makes it possessive. Here's a couple of more. Thanksgiving is not a contraction of anything, so it really does, there's no reason for an apostrophe there. And it does not make a word plural over on the glass for the bishop's family reunion. I assume it's the bishop family. So it's the bishop family reunion. It really doesn't need the apostrophe S at all there. This actually is still right next to my office. Apostrophe does not make it plural in either case. You can barely see that, but it's pools, patios, sunrooms, and euros. There's no reason for any of those words to have apostrophes. I'm always on a mission. Here's one from Target. All the adults have one birthday, I'm assuming, or should it just say adult birthday? And then what belongs to the Harrisons? The mat. There should be no apostrophe there. You can see apostrophes do not make a word plural, and you can see that it's a huge problem. And I enjoy collecting examples. The pink part was actually from our local superior court to arbitrators. It's just crazy. Okay, now we'll go through these. We have about 20 minutes left. It's just choosing what you think the right one is. So you can do it mentally if you'd like. You're not being graded. So which would you choose, like or as, in this sentence? And the next slide will show you what the correct answer is. Very good, as. Here's the next one. It's necessary that you try and or try to arrange. Try to. Very good. And then to who or whom are you referring? Whom. And my tip for that is if you can replace with him, are you referring to him in this paragraph, then it would be whom. But if it's, are you referring to he, then it would be who. And I have to do that every single time I'm trying to make it, trying to figure it out. So I have to say every single time him or them, or her, but that doesn't help. So I use him. Everyone wants to know who or whom it seems wise to support. You think should be appointed? Sorry, I had old notes. You think he should be appointed, so it would be who. Excellent. Now the two winners' prizes were presented last night. You're talking about two winners. So it should be winners apostrophe S. I'm sorry, winners apostrophe. The prizes belong to the two winners. He appreciated you or your changing the report. Your, very good. A pronoun that modifies a gerund, which is the ing word, should be in the possessive. The members of the committee is or are meeting right now. Are is correct. You're talking about the members are meeting, not the committee. In my opinion, his performance has always been well or good. Good, excellent. Good is an adjective. It answers the question, what kind? So what kind of performance? As a mechanic, he's better qualified than anyone or anyone else. Should be anyone else when comparing a person, the mechanic, or thing with individual members of the group, other mechanics. Use the comparative and the words other or else. So because you're comparing him to other mechanics, he's better qualified than anyone else. The analyst and the president was or were present at the meeting. You're talking about two people. Good, so were is correct. Now, commas and semicolons. All jobs are important and you should do your best. Does that need a comma or a semicolon? It does, because all jobs are important and you should do your best are to separate two main clauses in a compound sentence that are joined by and. Mr. Potter, whom we met last week, is to have lunch with us today. So you're really talking about Mr. Potter, whom we met last week, is extra information. It's non-essential, so you could say Mr. Potter is to have lunch with us today. The report that is dated January 30 is now out of date. That one's good as it is because you need to know which report. So it's the report dated January 30. Greta understands the work. Furthermore, she is proficient in French. She understands the work, semicolon. Furthermore, comma, she is proficient in French. The independent clauses linked by the transitional expression. Since I was uncertain about the facts, I made some inquiries. Be a comma there. Since I was uncertain about the facts, it's a dependent clause. I made some inquiries. Mr. Barnes invited Mr. Blaine and I, me, or myself to tour the factory. Should be me. Excellent. Reflexive pronouns are another problem that I see a lot. You only use the self words, like myself, when it reflects back on the pronoun. So think of a mirror as reflexive. So if you said I earlier in the sentence, you could say myself. But if you didn't, then you can't say myself. And I have friends who do that all the time. I think now they do it a lot just to irritate me, but they still do it. Ms. McGlynn accepted the invitation without me, myself knowing about it. Should be my knowing about it. The my pronoun modifies the gerund again and should be in possessive form. The only one he interviewed for the job was she or her. Should be her. He interviewed her. This one trips me up every time. Would you like we or us assistants to tally the votes? And it should be us. If you mentally omit assistants, it makes sense. Would you like us to tally the votes today? Either the desk or the files was or were damaged in moving. When you have singular plural words connected by either or, the verb agrees with the nearer part. So the files were damaged. Very good. A few of our actors prefer or prefers to travel by car because few is always plural. It needs a plural verb. So they, you can replace it. I replace it with they. They prefer to travel. Many a man and woman have or has taken part in these fund drives. It's many have. Very good. Economics is or are a subject that should be required of everyone. Is. The verb agrees with the subject in number and in person. So economics is a singular subject. So it should be is. Now a or an. We hope to arrive at a or an uniform code. And it should be a because it's the sound of the word that follows. So U in uniform with the Y sound requires a. And I think those have all changed since I learned it in the 4th grade. Because it used to be if it was a vowel, it was an. But that isn't really the way it is anymore. It is by the sound of the following word. So George ate a sandwich and a or an apple. Because apple has the vowel sound, it would be an. He is making less or fewer errors in his calculation. Fewer. Fewer refers to a number, and you can count the errors, and it's used with plural nouns. Less refers to a degree or amount, and is used with singular nouns. Of all the test scores, hers is the higher or highest. When you're comparing more than two, use the superlative form. So all the test scores, hers is the highest. Now lie or lay. When Mr. Unger is out, lie or lay his work on the desk face down. Very good. Lay is to put down or place, so it should be lay. I have not been able to sleep lately. I just lie or lay there awake. That should be lie. It's to recline, rest, or stay. Sit or set. Do not sit or set packages where someone might steal them. That would be set. Set is to place something somewhere. They have sit or set our chairs out for the meeting. Again, it's set because it's to place something somewhere. Sit means to be in a position of rest or to be seated. So my tip is if your butt's involved, it is sit. Apostrophes. The two pedestrian accidents were not related. So we're talking about two pedestrians. So the two pedestrians, apostrophe, accidents were not related because there are two, you make the word plural first because there are two of them, and then make it possessive. The ad proclaimed the latest style in lady furs. If you made that plural, ladies, apostrophe. They're furs designed for ladies, and all the furs don't belong to just one lady. Okay, who going to read the note in his absence? Would be an apostrophe for a contraction for who is. A few day delay would cost us too much money. So you make it plural first, and then add the possessive, few days delay. Mr. Edwards' honesty has never been questioned. In this I see mistakes a lot. His name is Edwards, so start with that. Don't change the spelling of a person's name to make it possessive. I've worked for a couple of attorneys whose names end in S, and I'm shocked at the number of people who put the apostrophe before the S, even though, so they're respelling their name. So just keep it spelled the way it is and then work with it. And Joanne's luncheon were scheduled separately. Trouble turning pages. So it should be Alice's and Joanne's. You're talking about two separate luncheons. So they're separate. They're possessive separately. Okay, now find the error. The lady who you danced with on stage is very graceful. Where do you think the error is in that sentence? Should be whom. She danced with him. They're exhibiting historical items at the fair. Should be they are. This is the Facebook error. Our staff have timely completed the project and is eager to accept the next challenge. Should be has. Staff is singular when you have a group of people acting as one unit. Like staff, it should be singular, so it should be has. got more of this kind of stuff, but we've got 5 minutes. So let me go to the end so you have my information. Oh, let's look at some of the funnies again. These were random capitalization. I'm just always surprised at the what people do for advertising. But these are random capitalizations. This was should be you are in the second line, Y-O-U''RE. And this was random apostrophes, capitalization, your. It was just, yep, crazy. This one, apparently only items sold to the charity make a donation, get the donation. A lot depends on the way things are worded as well. So here's my information. I'm going to unmute you and see if you have any questions, and we can talk about anything you need.
The conference has been unmuted.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
You did really well.
Excuse me?
You did well on those little quizzes.
I'll tell you what, it's been quite a long time since I have, like as you mentioned before, the 4th grade.
Uh-huh.
I'm trying to get ready to take the exam.
Uh-huh.
And the grammar and the punctuation part just kind of scares me.
Yeah.
Intimidates me a bit because it has been so long. So this is awesome. This is very helpful.
Good, good. Do you have any specific questions?
No, I've got some stuff to digest. I do have the Greg's reference book, and so I look at that. And I think I remembered way back, about the single quotation marks within the double. But
right.
The years I had gotten a little fuzzy.
Right, right. And I have a blog on proofreading, so if you want to visit there and sign up to get information, because I do.
Of your contact info.
I'm sorry?
Get a little screenshot of your contact info, so that way I've got it.
Oh, good. Okay. And you should be getting a copy of this PowerPoint, I think, if that would be helpful to you too. Yep.
It's good. Yeah, I like the at-a-glance stuff.
Uh-huh.
And I've also been making myself like flashcards.
Yep. That's very helpful.
So this is
I'm
awesome.
always available if you have questions. If you just can't figure something out, just email me, and I may not get back to you immediately, but I will get back to you.
All right. That's perfect. I'm sorry that you took your evening for just one person, but I really, really, really appreciate your time.
That's all that matters to me, so I'm so glad it was helpful. And best of luck to you on your exam.
Thank you very much. You have a great evening.
You're welcome. Thanks, you too.